Okay, everybody, we're just going to continue on now with our long-term plan workshop. So I'll hand back over to Melissa.
Thank you. So, yeah, shouldn't take us to get through the remaining of this workshop. We'll be doing the revenue and finance policy first, including fees and charges, and then we'll hand over to Tony for the development contribution fees.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you, Zoe. So the revenue and finance policy, we discussed it with you as part of a workshop earlier, but with a view of our fees and charges falling outside the revenue and financing policy parameters. So the policy sets out who pays for what, and in addition to the discussions we had at the workshop, other proposed changes that you'll see in the marked up version circulated to you is that we've included the reference to the preamble of the Te Ture Whenua Māori Act. As we discussed at the workshop, the principles are given effect through the rates and remissions policy. Another change that we've made is that our district-wide funding now only gets rated through capital value rates, as well as our UAGC, our Uniform Annual General Charges. We previously had, under the targeted area rate section, we had a portion of district-wide funding funded through the target area rates. We went through a process of slowly phasing that out, and with this plan, we are totally phasing that out. We have made provision for a new targeted rate, just a reference to the curbside refuse collection. This work will be undertaken as part of the next LTP as to exactly what that service would look like and what the cost associated with the service will be. And when we look at the community facilities section, we've removed the activity heritage as the activity is combined with our parks and reserves activity. And as discussed at that previous workshop, we've removed the district-wide funding portion from our 3 waters targeted rates. Sorry, we've moved it to targeted rates. So you'll see the changes in the marked up version of the revenue and financing policy. And just a question in terms of when we talk about targeted rates versus targeted area rates, what's the difference? So our targeted area rates are rates that has a fixed amount per rating unit, and it's collected on a differential basis based on the location of the property. It's used to meet the community or group benefit element of the activity. For instance, our community boards, our community grants, the Cambridge Pool, the TA Event Centre, district museums, community properties, Cambridge Town Hall, an element of the recycling, and then the cycling centre of excellence. On the other hand, our targeted rates are rates based on a rate in the dollar for our capital value properties, or alternatively a fixed amount per property, per soup. And these are normally where you receive the benefit of the service, for instance, our waters, or when you use the activity within your area, like our rural halls or town halls. That's a targeted rate set by the halls. Recycling for the cost of that service for the users that use the service. Our curbside refuse collection would probably look similar. And our community, Cambridge Community Sports Hall. Yeah. So then on the fees and charges schedule, this is the first time that we've shared the draft schedule with you. What we've done is we've changed the review cycle to align with each LTP. So for this year, we are looking at finalizing or formalizing fees for 25-26, our year 1, as well as 26-27, year 2. With some flexibility retained should changes in the market necessitate us to do an annual review out of cycle. So changes we discussed at our 11 November workshop has now been incorporated. One of the outstanding matters was a request to see if we can smooth the increase on the cemetery fees rather than in the big increase in year 3, have the increase over 2 years. So with that, if you look at the material that's been circulated, that table, cemetery fees now falls within the policy ranges of the revenue and finance policy. It does, however, fall outside those policy ranges from year 6 onwards. For that, we'll have to do an in-depth review of the fees and also benchmarking with the next LTP. And then again, the change of our Three Waters funding structure, as explained in the previous slide. So the process we followed was we started with the 24-25 fees as they currently are, increased the majority of our fees with the projected LGIC to arrive at the 25-26 fees. There were some exceptions when the managers looked at some of their activities and they could identify the true cost structure. If that necessitated a change, that change was affected. Then from there, another projected LGIC increase to arrive at the 26-27 fees. I will take questions. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Yolanda. All right, any questions on this so far? No, let's carry on. All good.
So, hi everyone. I'll touch on the development contribution charges that we've developed through the LTP process and in tandem with all the work that's gone through that very large process. So I'll highlight that the work that we've done to date, I might have pressed the wrong button there. Never mind. The work that we've done today, we've done 3 separate workshops. 2 of those were through the previous LTP before we changed and pivoted to that enhanced annual plan approach. And then a separate workshop that was held in September that covered off the work that we've done today, refreshed what we'd undertook, and then also showed through the draft policy in November as well, and take into account all those other parameters. Through that last workshop as well, we also included some development agreement interest payments and extensions to those to ensure that developers were incurring the cost of any expiration date extension to any development agreement, which is still at council's discretion to utilise whether or not it wants to do that or not. We also added in some inclusionary measures into the draft policy with PC26 now having the full request of the adaptation and the information we received from Minister Bishop in terms of our approach to PC26, the areas that were included and those areas that weren't included in PC26 with our last submission. So we've adopted the policy in alignment with what will be fully adopted, and I believe that's looking to be adopted sometime in February for the full adoption of PC26, which is our medium density housing provisions. In terms of the other work we've done, we've reviewed the methodology report as well that helps inform the policy and inform our assumptions. And the key changes in there were around the adjustment in household projections, reducing the number of standard section size from 650 squares down to 500 based on the sales data that we'd seen through and all the section analysis of the recent developments that we'd had on the books. We updated the tables for water, wastewater and stormwater in alignment with our demand profiles that we'd seen from our water user charges and also industry practice with regards to the water consumption versus the ratio to the wastewater consumption. So we've done some work behind the scenes with that. We also introduced some different density typologies in alignment with some of the other high growth councils to give a bit of a range and a bit of incentive to drive some intensification in certain areas that might not have predicted to have it beforehand. That gave ranges based on their GFA of the buildings themselves. So that's now adopted into the policy. And then the last thing that we did around that was well, 2 last things I should say. The other one was the multipliers that we added into industrial growth cells. So we gave different demand modifiers based on the different activity. The likes of roading, we gave given the heavy vehicles and the industrial growth cells, that's high demand on the roads. Therefore, there's a higher amount of spread in demand that goes against that capital infrastructure investment. And then lastly, we also added in provisions for Papakainga, similarly under the same act that was mentioned before in the preambles of the Te Ture Whaimana, Whenua Māori, thank you very much, with regards to the enablement of Maori general land. and ensuring that we are providing the right means of reviewing those papakaingas that come through as a commercial lens, or if they're coming in with a more community benefit lens. So that's the initial what we've done to date. And I do notice that Roger's got his hand up, so I'm happy to take a question here.
Okay, look, that sounds great. Roger, do you want to?
Oh, yes. Yeah, thanks. Have you finished, Tony?
I've finished on the work done to date, Roger, but we'll go through the rates and anything. So if there's anything in particular with this, I'm happy to pause here with a query.
It is to do with the average hue that you've reduced from 650 to 5.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And on the comparative page, which is page 8, and then we're talking about the actual the rates for the different growth cells. The DC rates 2024, 2025, are they based on 650 or 500?
So they're previous rates that we utilised back from 2021. Through those annual plan processes, we only made subtle adjustments in alignment with the non-consultative process. So they'll be based off the 650 square metre rate size for the HEU model build assumption.
And the draft DC rates you've got now are based on 500?
Correct.
So, yeah, so my question is very much of the DC totals that you've got, and I'm just looking, if I can, at C1. C1 for a 650 squares was 73, but now for a 500 squares, which is considerably smaller, it's gone up to 1989. Am I right in reading that?
Correct.
Crikey dick. So they've gone up remarkably.
Correct. And I'll get to that in the future slides.
Sorry, I'll leave that until because another couple of questions regarding that. So go on with the rest of your presentation.
Yeah, we'll just take one from Claire and then we'll carry on, Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Just on this slide, the last point under reviewed policy, the top section, it says inclusion of PC 26 provisions. Yep. Yes, could you just go over what those are? Yeah, I'm just really interested to see how that plan change is reflected in the DC policy.
So it's only reflected through, instead of partial adaptation, just using full adaptation. So we haven't done anything with regards to the methodology report of what goes through from the assumptions, because we just are uncertain as to how much the uptake's going to be. So what we do is we reference Plan Change 26, and we previously did as well, but we referenced it as partial. We changed it from partial adaptation to full adaptation. Oh, okay. So in terms of the breakdown of what that means for the policy, it's nothing at this point in time. Oh, okay. We haven't changed those baseline assumptions because we're just not sure what the uptake will be in medium density housing. Okay. And through the next LTP review, that will be something that we closely monitor in terms of uptake.
Cool. No, thanks very much.
Just one methodology question on the wastewater charge, or not the wastewater calc. Did I hear you correctly that you're basing that as some sort of percentage of water used?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Whereas we rate as a pan charge rather than a use.
Yes.
Yeah. There's no logic problem there. It's just we're running two different sort of methodologies for DCs and rates.
Yeah, it comes down to where RITS derives its demand generation, where the DC model and where council derives its assumptions from is from the RITS. So the RITS gives you a percentage breakdown, and that's how most of wastewater's demand is reviewed and designed. It's based off what is a comparative order of wastewater generation for an average consumer versus what you're expecting from the actual household to deliver. And it's generally based on around 70%. Watercare, I believe, outlined different typologies based on apartments where they're not having so much go to a garden, so therefore it goes up to about 78%. So it's around the consumption comparative of, if you're turning on a tap, how much of that is just going directly down the drain, and that's the comparative between it. And it's a ratio that's been utilised for a significant amount of time in engineering, is that comparative between between the two things. Generally, because you're not generating more waste into the system than what's coming out of what you're drawing from. And if the definition of that would be considered sort of a wet industry if you're generating more waste than what's coming through, like a butchery or a meatworks industry. So I'll then go over to the rates, which Roger has highlighted some of the higher ones with regards to C1. And I will identify a few outliers in this area with regards to some of the massive increases, I will say. The likes of C4, we previously had that in the range of the same as the Cambridge Carapero amount, which was about 12,000 the previous year. That is now increased to be around 50K. And that's due to the fact that in the last LTP, we didn't have the actual costs of the infrastructure that enable the C4 growth cell within them. That includes the collector roads, wastewater pump stations, and all of the reserve infrastructure that goes in there as well. So there were a few outliers like that as well. T11 is also a new charge, as that previously wasn't in the LCP. Another large outlier, which is around 173% increase, is Kiki. The reason for that is through the enhanced annual plan, we actually reduced that DC in the enhanced annual plan remit. The reason we did that is because we didn't want to over-collect in terms of the DCs for that growth cell. So we removed out the projects from that, and now we're including back in the additional projects to inform the LTP, and including interest and the other interest inflation capacities in there as well. So the enhanced annual plan allowed us to remove those projects to ensure we weren't over-collecting and therefore needing to refund the developers.
Thanks, Tony. Happy to take a question from Roger?
Oh, sorry, I just put it up there so when you finish, Tony, are you finished?
I can speak more to the total increases, but that is the next slide. If you want me to talk to those.
Yeah, talk to those first, and then I'll come in with a question. Yep.
So those were the major outliers in regards to that in terms of those increases. And then just a more general look around, okay, well, the rates have varied between 36 to 319. So mentioned those outliers. And then when we talk about the likes of the decreases, the main costs are around, we've fully recovered certain projects in our reserves of the model. So they've actually come off the books to ensure we're not over collecting and requiring to repay developers based on a DC that doesn't quite stand. Certain areas had accelerated uptake. So the rural area had a much larger uptake than what our DC model predicted. That's due to people trying to go for a different type of lifestyle. And our rural charges are generally pretty averaged out and consistent across there. We don't expect a high uptake or spikes in uptake. It just plays to the market in that regard. The increased density, so some growth cells being on that 650 when we had that section analysis come back at 500 square metres. So that did happen. And then also the multipliers within the industrial catchments. So if you have a higher multiplier and the demand being spread across that, the actual charge is going to be lower in terms of that. So that's the likes of Hautapu, where that's seen no real change in there, even though we've seen the massive increases in interest and all the other good things in there. And then that feeds into the increased factors. Lending has doubled. And our length of time that we're trying to capture and recover these costs, that's over a long period of time. So that has a major fluctuation in regards to these DC rates. So it takes up to quite a significant portion of the actual charge itself, not the CapEx charge. And then obviously we've got the escalation of costs, which we saw over the last sort of 3 years and years prior, with rapid inflation and rapid house land value costs and negotiations starting to get quite significantly higher than what we thought they would be. And then we also had lower uptake on top of that due to a myriad of reasons, but mostly around due to banks' lending criteria and allowing people to actually purchase the properties. They were a lot stricter than going in there. And as previously mentioned with the likes of where we had to do the budget deferrals, Waka Kotahi funding and other subsidy share funders, that doesn't look like it's panning out. So we removed that and put it more onto the growth percentage as a result. So a good example of that would be the C4 Kaipeki roundabout that's required. So there's a main roundabout in there. There was some expected increase in costs to come through from Waka Kotahi, but they have since said that no, there's no funding there. Similarly would be the C6 roundabout that's required, the Lamb and Rororangi Road intersection there. There was meant to be a roundabout in there with $1 million share coming from Waikaitahi, who have subsequently removed that funding from their books. So in turn, that means that the cost then needs to go into the growth and demand generation that it causes it, and that in turn increases the fees. But these are more of a holistic, this is why they've had such dramatic increases. And when you do see the likes of C1 increasing by a factor of 22%, that is largely the interest component. That is a massive amount of interest that has jumped onto that, because you're still predicting it over a 10-year cycle, and that needs to be incurred by the developers. If it was to stay the same, and if we had interest that was, consistent over that period of time, you would have likely seen a jump, but nowhere near as dramatic than what that interest component is causing.
Clear.
I've got a question about the Ngahanapuri DC, because the increase in reserves, has gone from 0 to 9,400. Is that because that money is going to go for a particular reserve development in Ngahanapuri?
Yes, so that was due to the fact that the intent of the developer to lead a private plan change to uplift the N3 growth cell. And the N3 growth cell is the area which was going to house the reserve. So it's bringing forward that funding through the LTP in alignment with that intent.
Oh, no, that's right, because I did get asked a question at one of the community engagement things that we had recently about whether or not that those DCs for Ngahanapuri would go back to Ngahanapuri for that. I think it's the Mangahaya.
Yep.
Walkway. Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Cool.
That's really helpful.
Isn't there some statutory limit on reserves? On DCs? 30% or
Yes,
something?
there's a statutory limit on reserves. It's 7.5% of the average section sale price with regards to an area. So we've got to do that analysis, but the last time we checked, it was our reserves totals were equaling about 1%. So we're well below that requirement.
That limit would apply per DC catchment, wouldn't it? It
Yes.
wouldn't be globally.
Yeah.
So, to Claire's point, it would have to comply with the 7%.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
it would.
Yeah, my understanding was it was a request of the developer that it be set at a level that would allow the development of the reserve, like it was almost.
Oh,
Or
it's
was it a personal one for him, or not?
no, it's an old hangover from the previous funding model that DCs used to. So before DCs were around in 2002, there was another fee remit that was applied, and that reserve quantum was an old legislative directive that continued on. We've never breached that, and the DCs that we've looked at here, we haven't done we've got to do that check in the next steps, but it's not we don't see any area where that's going to actually draw a concern.
All right, thanks for that. Okay, we'll go to Roger online.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Just going back C1 and C3 again, obviously those increases are quite substantial. I've just had a quick work out that if you looked at the old DC rates, which were based on 650, and you reduce that down to effectively a 500 square rate, then in fact the increases would be in C1 58% and C3 77%. They seem incredibly high to just be interest. And that's working on a per square meter, which is the only way that we could get really equivalent comparison.
That's why it's a combination of factors, but the main proponent being interest. So the inflation increased by 20%, 22% across each project. Land values increased by 46%. So when you embroil all those with the lower growth, you do get quite significant increases. There's also been a reduction in the assumption for the likes of C3, where the wastewater charge doesn't apply to the Te Awa portion of the growth cell because they are on lot. So we did have to remove some functional components of that from the DC's charge and the HEU charges as well. Okay. So it's a combination of factors. You're right, they are substantial increases, but they're actually mitigated by the fact that we did increase the amount of HEUs to spread them across. So it's by that assumption base that we're able to mitigate that increase to that significant level that you're talking about.
Right. Also looking at C1, and I'm sure there's valid reason, but the wastewater seems to have gone up by 6K and the roading gone down by 7K in terms of the individual charges. What was the underlying reason? Because it's obviously that it's still within that rate, but it seems to have swapped from, you understand what I'm getting at?
Yes, so you'll see across the board with all of the Cambridge growth cells that the wastewater charge is dramatically increased. That's due to the fact that the Cambridge wastewater treatment plant's over a 30-year return period, and therefore the interest component does affect that quite significantly. So you're talking about 33% of 108 million across 30 years across the growth cells. So that component of infrastructure is going to be quite dramatic. C1 also included an additional wastewater pump station through the process of the LTP going from here to here. Through the development of the Stratton Properties development, they needed another wastewater pump station that also allowed for enablement of a wider growth, therefore a terminal. So there's an additional project in there than what was previously in the C1 2021 LTP. With regards to the roading, that is shared further across the board with Cambridge growth, with the Cambridge infill, due to the fact that the beneficiary analysis of that project split it across those two growth cells because it's the project pertaining to the Norfolk Drive intersection upgrade. So that cost, it got spread across those two there. So you can see that the Cambridge Karapiro roading charge, that did increase.
Right. And in terms of, let's say, C3, that 91,000, that will just apply to what's left in terms of greenfield, is it?
Correct. We've also factored in the most recent subdivision of the 3M St. Peter's JV into these calculations. So that revenue is already identified through the project. And this is the remaining surplus HUs without that historic revenue counted.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions to date? No? Do you have much? You have more on your presentation, don't you?
Do
little bit
have
more,
just
okay.
one item to raise is that there is some slight, I'm going to say errors with regards to these totals. It's a rounding error on about 4 different ones here where they're out by $1. So when we update these through the table 3 of the DC policy, we'll be adjusting those rounding errors. It's where we pull the DC model through. It doesn't actually just equate to those totals. It actually pulls from the model to give you a total separate from those individual areas there, where behind there's quite a few different decimal places. And it's just a +1 or -1 in regards to those. So we'll tidy that up with regards to that. And if we go to the next steps here, the next step will have the DC policy with alignment with the final financial strategy policies, and we'll include that breakdown in the updates in the actual table 3 of the policy.
Thanks, Tony. So I'm quite interested. I think you've got a developer forum that you mentioned you were going to hold in sometime next year, February, I think it was.
Yep.
So I'd be quite interested to hear some of the feedback from that forum. Obviously, a lot of it will be that, the prices have gone up in some cases. That's probably not unexpected, but it's any other bits of information or I guess other changes that we've made that they may or may not agree with. It'd be good to get that feedback, but also what they see at other councils. If there's something that a part of other people's policies that we haven't included, that or has been trialled elsewhere, it'd be good just to kind of continue to sort of think outside the square a little bit. So yeah, interested in any suggestions that they might be forthcoming with as well.
Yes. So firstly, we are looking at a developer forum with regards to February and reaching out to our development community. Ahead of that, I have indicated to a few key developers what these rate increases will be. So we have had some direct engagement with developers in the likes of Cambridge North, C1, C4, and other areas where there were significant increases. So we have reached out to those developers ahead of time. With regards to, I suppose, innovation in the policies, that's where it comes down to the typologies and including those mitigations to give a different way of assessing those DCs and get them lower. But in terms of other high growth councils, we did do an analysis against Tauranga and HCC. So Tauranga's DCs increased on average around about 0.3 to 3%. The main reason for that increase being so low is regards to the IFF funding. So they went with a different direction that pulled a separate levy off that couldn't double dip into these areas. They were working on their secondary IFF approach for the internal to the CBD and doing some commercial infrastructure in there, which actually had to remove those charges from the DC pool as well and repay those developers that had already experienced those charges. In doing so, that levy sits on the current ratepayer. So that comes off as a separate bill from their bills, from their rates. It comes in, but essentially the growth percentage gets paid by the current growth that's going to occur, but also the current ratepayer. They have to service that loan as it comes through. And then with regards to HCC, they capped their charges in some areas and also phased them. So phasing is a way of indexation. So it lowers the DC in the initial years to try and entice developers to develop, and then in the later years increase that interest and increase and spike the DC for developers in later years, typically around year 7 of their model that they operate. And that's quite a significant jump in price, and it allows the early people to get in and, develop at a lower charge, and then council holding the risk for any of that interest and deferral if development doesn't occur at a later date. They also capped 5 different growth cells, and that was based on the areas such as Peacocks. They kept them at, I believe, around 664,000, but they also demonstrated in their report what their charges should have been, which is around the 93,000. So a change of about 29,000. So that 29,000 per HEU is no longer being shared by the growth community. That is being directly paid for by the ratepayer. So essentially, in both instances, that approach doesn't allow for growth to pay for growth in a fair and reasonable manner. And the HCC approach went against the council staff's recommendation to cap those rates. So the council staff recommendation at the time was to impose those full charges. And that's essentially what we've tried to do through this means, is to say that growth should be paying for growth, and hence the full charge should apply.
Thanks, Tony. Look, I guess we've had that stance for some time. We really feel quite strongly as a council that growth should pay for growth. And I can see that that's working very, very well for most of the district. But do you think there should be some sort of incentivization for developers, maybe in some other parts of our district we're not seeing growth as high as perhaps what it could be? Because that's really all we're talking about, right? It's incentivizing developers to come into parts of the district that we would like to see grow. Do you see an opportunity here for that potentially in the future, or are you really quite happy with how things are tracking?
I'm quite happy with where things are tracking in terms of the robustness of the policy. Typically what happens is when you demonstrate what these rates are, you get a flurry of applications in for where the areas are going to be dramatically increased. We saw it all through the last time when we adopted the 2021 policy. We had an influx of applications that occurred prior to June and into July before the formal adaptation, because at the time of the consent lodgement, that's the DC policy that applies. So developers really, it's up to them when that time is going to work for them for their investment. They have other remits with regards to that typology arrangement with the GFA that enables them to give you a different mix of what gets supplied. There's also other remits to apply as well, like the special assessment. We haven't changed that special assessment in the DC policy, but it is there for them to bring on external factors that can enable us and review those to ensure that they're getting some feeling of deal if they're providing further density or other means that enable that. So there are already options in the policy. If through this process that developers try to pitch additional thought processes, excluding indexation, because we have workshopped that several times, I'm sure we'll be willing to hear that through the consultation process.
Okay, all right, thanks for that. Okay, Claire.
Thanks, Tony, about the comparison like with Hamilton City Council. So I'm a bit concerned about the capping that's gone on for certain growth cells. I think you mentioned Peacocks. It's just that conversations that I've been sort of involved in with Hamilton City, I understood that they wanted to ensure that there was parity between us and them, so that, you know, there was a level playing field, I guess, and there wasn't any artificial lowering that would, you know, sort of push developers to one part of the district rather than another, or, you know, one like either HCC or us. So are you concerned about this practice of capping or something? Do you think it would it be at a scale where it might affect, you know, the level of activity that we have in our growth cells?
Overall, I don't think DCs are the defining factor that which drives economic growth or a market to develop XYZ. It really comes down to where is the market demand and where is the developer that has land to develop.
Yeah.
So overall, I don't feel that the development community shifts its locations based on where they want to see demand. The demand directs where they develop. And therefore, Hamilton's already the fastest growing city in New Zealand. We're still seeing growth in applications and we're still seeing subdivision applications. There's enough to go around between the two of us.
Yeah, cool, no, thanks.
Thanks, Tony. I think we do get a lot of comfort from your analysis and also your your ability to look into the future and that crystal ball as well.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions on the DCs? It is a really important conversation for us to have had today, I think. And no doubt, yeah, we'll wait and see what the forum comments and feedback is. I'm sure we'll be told if we haven't got it right, but it feels like there's been some good steady increases covering all our bases, hopefully covering all our costs. That's the most important thing. All right, any other questions? No, all right. Back to you, Melissa.
Thank you. So the next stage for both the development contributions policy and the fees and charges, including the revenue and financing policy, is to be presented to council for formal adoption on the 17th of December. Just on the fees and charges, can I just check in that you're all happy with where things are at? Just so I know there wasn't a lot of discussion.
There weren't any questions, but we have some now. So, Mike.
I thought we were focused on the DCs. Hey, just around the residential developments and the Hughes, just want to, I've written something down here which I struggle to understand. So this might be a Tony question. If someone, this is about the minor dwelling thing and the total size of a house before it goes from, say, 1 Hugh to 1.2, for instance. So if you're building a house, a garage and effectively a separate dwelling, or a minor dwelling, are they treated separately in terms of, let's say the main house is 220 squares, that generates 1 Hugh, including the garage, and then the second dwelling is, let's say, 60 or 70, therefore a total of 1.5 Hughs. It doesn't become 1.7 because the overall footprint is...
It's based on the consent itself. So you'll have 2 independent building consents with regards to the actual granny flat, as it were, or sleep out arrangement. And only through that definition of the policy, if it has a kitchenette, would you actually be applicable for a charge.
Yeah.
With regards to the main building, it will just be based on its current merit around what the size of that is. We typically don't include garages in that assessment. We do for the stormwater perspective, but the entirety of that is more the net area of the house that's been developed. We don't include decks either.
So that, thank you.
All right, back to you, Melissa.
So sorry, just jumping back to fees and charges. For full transparency, there is a couple of tidy ups to the charges for Mighty River Domain following a discussion with you, Liz. So we'll present those along with a whole package of other financials. So all the financial policies, the high level budget position, and the forecasting assumptions to council on the 17th of December for adoption. This will enable us to do some more detailed work on the financials, and we'll present that to you for formal adoption on the 28th of January alongside a lot of the non-financial information. So it will be a very comprehensive package, and then this will be presented to audit on the 3rd of February for auditing. Also, just want to check in on the timeline and parking lot, if there are any questions on that.
Did you say the 3rd?
The 3rd of February for auditing, but that information that's being presented to audit,
We haven't got any dates
so
for,
it's our audit team, not audit and
got
risk.
any dates for all that stuff?
28th of February, 28th of January.
28th.
Yeah, but the 3rd of February, we haven't got.
That's nothing to do with us.
Oh,
That's
would
when
you?
it passes to
Yeah,
audit.
yes.
Oh,
All right, team. Okay, I think that if there's no other queries on fees and charges, look, we'll wait till the papers come out and we can take a look at those next week. Right, are there any other items for today?